In our last presentation, we talked about the distortion created when we confuse money for wealth. As we alluded to before, money is just a unit of exchange to acquire wealth. But true wealth is arable land, potable water, bushels of wheat, and so forth. When we confuse the symbol for the real thing it represents, all sorts of cognitive errors happen. John Locke, in his book, Two Treatises of Civil Government, has some interesting insights. In Chapter 5, he expounds on how when people add their own labor to the land, there is little incentive to acquire more than you need or can use. Once the money system is introduced, he warns, distortion set in, because now people have a means to acquire more than they can actually use. He explains that one of the problems of antiquity was the perishability of wealth. Fish rot, wheat spoils, and so forth. They needed a store of wealth that would last permanently, so they sought after an enduring commodity. After a number of commodities, most nations eventually settled on gold. In the real world, Locke said, each family would only labor for as much fish as it could eat before it spoiled, so the community was not in danger of overfishing. But after money was introduced, it created a perverse incentive to acquire more resources than you could actually use. This got even worse after the Industrial Revolution, when new factories could produce far more surpluses than people could actually consume. In The Upcycle, by William McDonough and Michael Braungart, they write, when the Industrial Revolution manifested itself, people wanted simply to keep supply as high as demand. And as they did so, thinking grew frantic. Designers and manufacturers grasped for the next best short-term idea that came along, not necessarily informed by long-term considerations. Public relations expert Edward Bernays weighed in to say the same thing. When factories began creating surpluses, it had one good effect true. It brought the prices of everything down. With abundance, costs drop. So for the first time, ordinary people could afford what used to be luxuries in the past. The bad thing, though, was that the industrial machinery was so good at producing goods in excess that there was suddenly a storage problem. If 1 billion widgets just sat in the warehouses because there wasn't enough public demand to consume those widgets, then the manufacturers would have to pay warehouse costs. The answer was to create a public appetite for excess consumption. Bernays said that one of the techniques to get people to throw away perfectly good things in order to get them to buy new things was to create the concept of fashion. Tell them that something was out of fashion and that they needed the new thing, and they'll dutifully go out and buy the latest novelties. So instead of a single person consuming according to his needs, he was primed to buy things as if he had 12 feet, 3 stomachs, 8 hands, etc. This got even worse when the CEO of General Motors, Alfred P. Sloan, came up with the concept of planned obsolescence. This was the concept of purposely designing things to break down after a certain period to get people to buy more of the thing. So, for instance, if your computer breaks down, you end up over time buying 3 instead of simply having 1. People became consumption machines, and this answered to the needs of capitalism. The problem was the resource expenditure of the model. It was incredibly wasteful. We were no longer consuming according to our needs, but being encouraged to consume according to our wants. And desire, as the ancient Stoic philosophers warned us, was endless. Cicero, thousands of years ago, in On Moral Ends, denounced Epicureanism's claim that pleasure was the ultimate end of all acts, citing the Sybarites who would gorge themselves at banquets and then induce vomiting so as not to gain weight. Eating for pleasure, and not for the nutrition of the body, was not an act that could be said to be eating well, asserts Cicero. He then quotes a poem by Laelius, who writes, O Publius Galonius, O raging abyss, you are a miserable man. You have never eaten well in your life, though you spend everything on your prawns and on your gargantuan sturgeon. Cicero comments, the person talking here places no value on pleasure. He does not think that someone who makes pleasure the focus of his life can ever dine well. He does not deny that Galonius ate with gusto, for this would be false. He denied that he ate well. In this way, he sharply and clearly separates the concept of pleasure and the good. We may conclude from this that everyone who dines well dines enjoyably, but those who dine enjoyably do not always dine well. Laelius always dined well. And what is well supposed to mean? Lucilius would answer, cooked and flavored. But if I then offer up the main course with good conversation, and what is the end result? If you ask to dine with pleasure, with a tranquil soul he came to satisfy the normal desires of nature. Therefore he is correct in denying that Galonius ever dined well, and correct in calling him miserable, especially since all his attentions were focused on consumption. The stress should be placed on this last point, that consumption for consumption's sake is a sort of spiritual bulimia. So neoliberal economists, led by Milton Friedman, who expressed his happiness to depeg economics from means and ends as he put it, wants us to be consumers instead of citizens. People of this school of thought want us to consume for consumption's sake, which is a sort of economic bulimia, whereas many in the sustainability movement, such as Kate Raworth and Donella Meadows, would rather us consume only insofar as it conduces to our health, nutrition, and well-being. Of course, late-stage capitalism's call for us to overconsume has long been a complaint of the system, with even John D. Rockefeller himself admitting that capitalism was inherently wasteful. He famously said, "Competition is a sin." He was a monopolist, of course, and he didn't like having competitors, so his motives in saying this are obviously suspect. But in a certain sense, he's right. If you have 100 companies vying to sell cereal to a finite audience, there will be 2 or 3 winners, and the rest of the cereal will be unsold. It rots away. Those were resources that were wasted. But we justify this by saying that it's just the nature of capitalism. It's like Darwinism. In The Origin of Species, Darwin said that for every 100 animals, 98 will die so that 2 survive. Those 2 will be the fittest and will pass on their genes. In the early 20th century, we said this about corporations. It was called social Darwinism. For every 100 companies that existed, 98 would die so that 2 would survive. Natural selection is, of course, a very costly process. But before you think that it's just capitalism that's wasteful with its bent toward economic bulimia, don't imagine that socialism gets a pass. We'll explore the inefficiencies of centrally planned economies in the next presentation. The New American Magazine is now on Locals. It's a for-pay platform for like $5. It gives you access to extra content and allows you to support your favorite hosts. As I said before, think of it like throwing some coins into the cup of a street performer. Check it out at thenewamerican.locals.com.